Man, was that a pain in the butt. Hey MGTOWs, this is Vention. I'm having a little trouble with my transmission, just in case you're not guessing. Well, it's not a bad way to spend a day off. These hoses need to be replaced even if it doesn't happen to be leaking. That thing's loose as fuck. Anyway, I've been having a little problem with my transmission, just downshifting and cutting out, not really cutting out, but going into what they call limp mode, and it basically shifts down to like second gear, and then you're going full RPM at about 25 miles an hour on the freeway. It's embarrassing. Then you have to limp it off the freeway and back home, and it's mildly embarrassing. It's my opinion that when my second gear clutch went out on my transmission, I suspect that some debris came up through the cooler, and it's preventing the good flow through the system. So they say they flushed it, but I'm not convinced. So one of the things I'm going to do, the price wasn't very high, so I figured I'd just throw a new one in, get it out of the way. I might want to replace these hoses while I'm at it because they are freaking ugly. Got some of these new clips because they always break. What fun. In any case, I'm gonna pause this while I strip these gloves off, and I'll be right with you. Okay. I was just watching a YouTube video a while ago with and it was one of those hypothetical videos about what would happen if all the men in the world disappeared. And I tell you, they really lowballed the consequences to that situation. What happened? They were saying like, oh, it won't be as, I mean, there will be less war and blah blah blah. But I was kind of astounded that they that they ignored some of the more obvious problems. So anyway, let's just sort of put them side by side. What would happen if all the men in the world disappeared, and what would happen if all the women in the world disappeared? Okay, this is going to be a train wreck. And we'll compare how the population will collapse, because it'll decrease either way. But man, if the women are the only ones left, this freaking train is going down. This ship is sinking, man. Anyway, they basically were saying, well, I won't even bother what they'll say, but what I'm saying is that first of all, pretty much all of the pilots in the sky will disappear, and then all the air traffic controllers, pretty much all of them will disappear. And then you'll have all of the planes eventually crashing into the ground, right? The ones around the airports in the big cities will crash into the ground on takeoff, and they will cause fires, unbelievable fires. And pretty much all of the real firefighters, not the diversity hires and the women's, they might be able to squirt a little bit of water on it, but basically it would just, those fires would rage uncontrolled through the cities with no firefighters to stop it, right? Then basically the survivors, where the fires didn't kill everybody, there'd be a lot of people running or fleeing in cars. They would of course cause major traffic jams because they wouldn't be able to take the side roads. And then basically we would have like all of the store shelves, of course, would be empty within about a day, and then all of the warehouses will still be there, but no food will travel because no truck drivers, right? There's just a few truck drivers who are women. A lot of dispatchers trying to dispatch about 1% of the truck drivers, and then all of the utility workers would be gone, and all in these uncontrolled fires, the top power lines would come down, and then basically the power, and even uncontrolled, even if there was no disaster or fire, without maintenance and without management, the electrical grid would shut down within about probably 2 or 3 days. And then basically, of course, with no electrical power, the water grid would stop, and then the sewers would back up, and there would be no sewer workers because it stinks and no women work there. And then there would be, without any power, all of the nuclear power plants in the northern hemisphere and the south, the few that are in the southern hemisphere, would go into safe mode, and they would shut down, and the backup diesel generators would start up, and they would be pumping the coolant water until the diesel fuel ran out. Now, my question, I'm not sure about this, but I know there aren't a hell of a lot of female nuclear power plant workers, and certainly not many maintenance workers. There might be some secretaries and a few like white collar diversity hires, but there would be no wrench carrying mechanics to keep that freaking thing going. No truck drivers to bring diesel fuel to the nuke plants. So it's a possibility that some of those plants would melt down, and then, but man, there's a possibility that all of them could melt down if they couldn't get their shit together. And then if that was the case, it would kill billions, because we'd have like massive Fukushima dead zones and Chernobyl obliteration zones all over the northern hemisphere, and it would kill billions. We're not talking millions, we're talking billions. And then pretty much all of the genetic scientists would be dead, and almost all of the fertility workers would be gone, and and without the power grid, before any of the women would even realize it, the freaking fertility clinic stored sperm would thaw out, and pretty much it would pretty much be the end of it. And there would be some of those people who are frozen in cryogenic stasis, and they might be able to thaw them out and dump the bodies and take the testicles and the vas deferens where the sperm cells are stored, and they might be able to harvest that and do some artificial insemination possibly. But in any case, all of that would have to take place in the northern hemisphere, because there's not a lot of cryogenically stored people in the southern hemisphere. So if the northern hemisphere was wiped out, there would be a few pregnant women in the southern hemisphere, and some of the babies would be boys, and they would then grow up about 10, maybe 13, 14 years from now, and then have a hell of a time causing pregnancies throughout the remaining semi-elderly post-wall population. So basically it would just be a freaking disaster beyond disaster, and maybe 2 or 3% of the world's population would be alive, say 50 years from now, because most of the big farmers and the massive producers and the factory, the technical people, we'd all be gone, man. And basically it would just be maybe some of them would survive, and a lot of the ones in the southern hemisphere would probably end up with radiation poisoning, unless somehow women could get their shit together enough to keep some kind of industry going. But I'll tell you, I'm a heavy diesel truck mechanic, as you guys well know, and I have met none, absolutely zero female heavy diesel truck mechanics who are worth a shit. And when they do show up, they generally show up and they're very young and they're in their most vigorous part of their life, and some of them and even then, if they can go make it through diesel school, and they can get hired automatically, because the state's always leaning on us to hire women mechanics. And the few that we do manage to get, they're just at their once they're trained up at their absolute sprinting peak fast speed that they can possibly kick out, they are about as fast as the slowest old graybeard in the shop who's about to retire. And then since they're sprinting so hard and lifting shit that is just too heavy for them, they end up basically getting hurt time after time and hauled off to the hospital. Back and shoulder injuries are the most common, and then eventually they either give up and leave the industry, or they take a pay cut and go into management. Now, it may seem strange, but in my industry, the vast majority of management and office worker types earn less than trained journeyman heavy diesel truck mechanics. We are a valuable commodity, and that's one of the reasons why I'm not really afraid to let my opinions on marriage out in the shop, because first of all, pretty much all of them agree with me, and second of all, my skills as a mechanic are so valuable that if I have a few quirks, as long as I can push trucks through the shop and produce work that is profitable to the company, they're going to just say, who cares what your opinions are? If you can turn the wrenches, just stay here and do it. It's if anybody wants to be a heavy diesel truck mechanic, dudes, after you're trained up a little bit, you'll be able to look around and practically have your pick of all the shops around. You could go into marine, you could go into heavy diesel trucks like me, you could go into heavy equipment like Caterpillar tractors and all of that stuff, hydraulics, and you could, the world is open, dudes. You could go anywhere and do practically anything. Heck, if Bitcoins obliterate somehow and I find myself poor, it's quite conceivable that I could find a Cummins or heavy diesel truck shop in Cambodia and go to work. Like if the dollar tanks and the whole world economy implodes, it's quite conceivable that I might be able to turn some wrenches there. But even if we had like another ginormous Great Depression, we're talking 1930s stuff, right? A heavy diesel truck mechanic who is trained and can do electrical engines, hydraulics, and air brakes and all that good stuff, he's going to still be working. He may not be earning what he's earning now, but he could certainly find a job and work. So that's the awesome thing about my industry. But I got diverted here. Let's go back to what happens if all the men disappear. First of all, some women will have been diesel mechanics in the past, and they will be able to do something, just to barely keep a small fleet of something going, to keep the the let me check and see this phone is on. Yeah, good. That would be a bitch if I had shut it off. Anyway, so let's so basically there might be a few female mechanics and some trained female truck drivers, and they might be able to keep the freaking diesel tanks in the nuclear plants running. Now, as far as female nuclear engineers and stuff like that, I would not be very hopeful that they would be able to keep this shit going. So, and if the northern hemisphere went out, that's it, man. We're going back to throwing spears for a living. So, now let us compare the probable 98% die-off of the human race if all the men disappeared. And that's the remaining human race after the men disappeared I'm talking about. So let's compare that to what would happen if all the women in the world disappeared. So, first of all, there would be panic, like where did my wife go and all that. But basically after that, there'd probably be a lot of religious people who think it's the rapture and somehow all men are bad. Like the religious feminists would be worse. They'd be saying, oh, we're all evil and all the women were perfect and they got taken to heaven. Okay, well, whatever. So basically what would happen if that occurred, a lot of manginas and simps would get very depressed, and there might be some suicides, but the vast majority of all the men would adapt. We'd just dial up a little more porn, and all the industries that produce anything useful, except maybe some factory work in China. There's a lot of women there, but basically every industry in the world pretty much that has any importance at all would pretty much just keep going. And guys would go to work and the nuclear power plants would run just fine, and basically a lot of the retail industry, which is heavily female, that would shut down. But then again, the vast majority of the customers of retail are women anyway, so who cares? The smaller workforce in retail would be able to handle the smaller load. So basically, probably nothing there would happen. All the grocery stores, a lot of them have automatic checkouts, and the people who actually stock the shelves and lift the heavy stuff, they're mostly guys anyway, so very little disruption. All the trucks would still run, all the infrastructure, the plumbing, the electrical, the nuke plants, the farming, the most of the manufacturing would all just keep cranking along as it always has. Now, people would say, oh, but the human race would then go extinct. I don't believe it would, because we've got massive amounts of eggs that have been frozen from somewhat high IQ working women whose feminist beliefs caused them to not reproduce, and they just froze their eggs to put it off, and hopefully they could find a guy to marry and subsidize their reproduction. But basically all of those eggs would still be frozen and available. And so then basically we could just, thaw them out mix them with some sperm, which we will have plenty of, and then basically there is a placenta barrier in pregnancy, right? In between the womb and whatever is growing, the baby, and it prevents the woman's immune system from attacking the infant, right? Now, it's quite conceivable, in fact, almost certain that those little, those people who are immune challenged and they live in like a plastic bubble and all that, to prevent them from getting colds and stuff. Well, basically, they could do that with certain animals, probably, with, who knows, anything that had a womb about the same size. And then they could just put it in one of those enclosures, one of those things, and have like NASA white rooms if there's anybody in there to care for those animals, and then they could just implant the eggs into the uterus of the animals and pretty much grow. And then, of course, with some immune suppressant drugs, because they're cross species reproduction like that. I mean, there's like horses and mules and stuff like that, but there, as long as the egg and the sperm are there, chances are, and the fertilized ovum is there, chances are it would actually work. And we would have all the genetic scientists, all the scientists of pretty much all the scientists, and they would take care of that shit. And it would be expensive. You'd probably have to have groups of guys, and they probably wouldn't be gay because honestly, only about 3% of the population is gay. If you watch TV or movies, you would think about 30% are, but it's just not the case. But that wouldn't stop guys from cohabitating and combining incomes to purchase these reproductive services that the reproductive industry basically, which would then spring up. The economy or the political system would change dramatically because all the socialist voting women would be gone. So the immediate effect would be the whole freaking society would just have a massive political shift to the right, and free market and free markets, less government interference in people's affairs, and and less taxes because all the women who take the majority of the taxes would be gone, right? Now, don't get me wrong, I do not want this to happen. But if it did, we as human beings we would have a decrease in our population pretty darn dramatically, and especially in like low IQ countries that don't have the scientific capability. And then basically a lot of them would probably have massive wars and self-destruct in a crazy panicked self-destruction orgy. But I think the West would probably be a little bit more intellectual about it, and you would have probably the ones that have the money, the ones who actually have skills that are useful in the economy. They would pretty much be able to afford these services. So the next generation would probably be about 50% higher in average IQ than what we have right now. Okay, whoops, I think my phone's ringing. Okay, well, I think I will, hold on, let me reject that. Okay, guys, well, that's about it. If we had this massive, if basically women disappeared, the human race would have some problems, but there would be a smaller next generation, and it would have a bonus in that the average IQ of humanity would probably go up by about 40%. And then on top of that, so basically we'd get through it, right? And if all the men disappeared, the consequences and the death toll would just be catastrophically beyond insanely higher, and humanity would get through it either way. 1,000 years from now, there probably wouldn't be a huge difference. Maybe in IQ, I'm not sure. But basically, it would be pretty dramatic either way. But if we have to have a choice between the two, I would prefer that all the women disappeared rather than all the guys. So, well, that's about all I got for you. And don't get married.